The order has been made. Oscar Piastri has been asked to support Lando Norris in his bid for the championship. I'm not entirely convinced they really mean that. This call was made 2 months too late in my honest opinion. It really should have been made after the Austrian Grand Prix, when it became clear that McLaren's upgrade to the front wing had closed the gap between themselves and Red Bull considerably. It meant that Verstappen and Norris could really go toe-to-toe with one another, with no holds barred, no safety cars. Honestly, I feel like Lando driving angrily back to the pits and then ultimately having to retire because he shredded the back end of his car more than most of the fumbles that McLaren have made throughout the second half of the season. It cost him 10 points, whereas Max carefully drove it back, but nevertheless, Lando was still able to make more of a statement than he could at Imola when he was closing down the gap to Verstappen, who was compromised in terms of the curbs, and the problems with the RB20 really started to come to the surface. And in an interview with BBC's Andrea Benson, McLaren's team principal Andrea Stella has outlined their plan to prioritise the likes of Lando Norris over Oscar Piastri. But there's a caveat to it, and it might be only temporary. If you thought that McLaren would provide a really clear-cut, straightforward plan as to who has priority, you would be sorely mistaken. Because from what Stella has said, I am left all the more concerned that really, this is only going to be a temporary solution, and if things change after the Azerbaijan Grand Prix and Oscar outperforms Lando, we could be back to square one all over again. And also, it really highlights a relatively noticeable mismatch when it comes to the ideas as to who is the favourite lead driver between Zack Brown and Andrea Stella. They have conflicting opinions, even though they're trying to be diplomatic about it, and mostly doing diversionary tactics and going, hey, look at Red Bull over there! They're really bad, aren't they? Oh, they're struggling! Look at the power struggles over there! Just ignore our ones! Anyway, if you want to get the idea about what Stella said exactly, and what he didn't say, here's the quote right here. Ahem. We will bias our support to Lando, but we want to do it without too much compromise on our principles. Our principles are that the team interest always comes first. Sportsmanship for us is important in the overall way we go racing, and then we want to be fair to both drivers. What we don't want to see anymore is a situation like in Monza, in which we enter a chicane P1, P2, and we exit P1, P3, because that is a detriment to the team, obviously. The team interests come first, and these are the situations that above all we need to fix, because eventually, as a matter of fact, the way we entered the race in Monza left the door open this situation. After Monza, 3 objectives. We need to make sure that anything that happens on track is not to the detriment of the team. Objective the first. That's me saying that. We need to make sure that anything that happens on track is not to the detriment of the team. Objective the second. How do we win both championships, both drivers committed to help? And objective the third. We don't want to do it in a reckless way. Those are the 3 topics, and they define the way we go racing in Baku. This will be updated after Baku. This to me does not sound like a ringing endorsement toward Lando. It sounds reluctant, and most importantly, it's support with conditions. If Stella truly believed that Lando Norris had a real shot at the driver's title, then he would have offered unconditional support toward his driver. It should have been a much more obvious statement in saying the team backs Lando Norris unconditionally for his bid to go for the World Championship, and Oscar Piastri will help him every step of the way. That's all you need to say. But here, you barely get one sentence in and say, we might lean toward Lando, but we don't want to avoid our principles. And as I touched upon in my video from last week about how McLaren could lose both drivers if they're not careful, Andrea Stella has experience when it comes to team orders from the likes of Ferrari, who practically wrote the rulebook when it came to team orders. And this isn't Stella being all hurt and being part of the loser faction, like Felipe Massa having to take team orders from likes of Raikkonen and Alonso. No, he was seeing it from the point of view of the benefactor, Fernando Alonso, and realizing that ultimately it just simply doesn't work if you want a harmonious team who works together and you don't get any factions. It only leads to the other driver, in this case Massa, spiraling into a funk, before Massa got a boost when he went to Williams in 2014. And granted, his accident in 2009 probably affected him in some manner as well as the hammer blow that was 2008, but Alonso's presence really does have a habit of strangling the confidence out of his teammates, at least until now when we've seen Fernando Alonso at the announcement of Adrian Newey coming to the team practically bending the knee to Papa Stroll. And we've got photographic evidence of that, and yeah, Fernando, that's really not a good look. But at least it's not as bad as Oscar's post yesterday. I mean, of all days! Oh! Now, you might be thinking that I'm salty about this, that my boy Oscar is getting shafted, but what I'm getting here is that Andrea Stella, based on interviews recently, seems to be leaning toward Oscar more, ultimately. talking more about how Oscar is the future of McLaren and how they want to develop him into the complete article in regards to being a fully fledged McLaren archetype and bastion. They want to invest in him through the good times and the bad, make him basically the definitive driver of McLaren, their leader going forward into the late 2020s and maybe even into the 2030s if they can. And also, this is very important here, the article that I shared from BBC Sport, it doesn't stop there. It actually offers some insight from Stella as to how he broke the news to Oscar Piastri. Was Piastri going to pull a Webber and act aggressively or angrily? No, Oscar remained relatively his chill self. I mean, he does voice his expression of discontent and a little bit of disappointment. He did make his feelings clear that it would be painful to go against his instincts and driving to win, but if it's the best solution and the best thing to do at this precise moment for the team, then he will go along with this decision for the time being. I'm now taken back to the original quote that I shared with you from Stella about how things will be updated after Baku. That McLaren are going to be looking at this on a race-by-race basis instead of just making one flat decision and then sticking with it. It means that things could easily change if one driver outperforms the other in an unexpected way. For example, if at the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, Lando wins the race like he did at Zandvoort and Oscar struggles to get close to him, then McLaren will probably crystallise this new direction a little more and back Lando even further. However, if it doesn't pan out that way and Lando struggles, since Baku isn't a happy hunting ground for him, his best position is only 5th, then the narrative might change again, especially if Max rebounds in Baku and then goes on to get the podium and outscores Lando, or if Oscar has a tour de force and we get to see his true potential at Baku, since last year, due to his food poisoning, we really couldn't see what he could do in that slightly upgraded MCL 60. True. Lando Norris has also been affected by food poisoning and feeling not so well on a race weekend, and he's been able to get a decent result anyway, so it stands to reason that both drivers are extremely talented, and they are able to overcome illness to a certain extent, and still get some points at least. So fair play to Lando Norris for still committing to the cause and still completing a Grand Prix weekend, even if he's a little bit under the weather. But we still need to remember that we don't really know what Oscar can do in a Formula 1 car yet, so that's a little bit of an enigma, so I think Lando should really make the most of this decision for Baku. So even though McLaren has gone down this path, who's to say that the path won't deviate for Singapore, and then for Austin, and then so on? I think they really do need to be a little bit more rigid for the fact that they left this decision far too late. Again, they really should have looked at the Austrian Grand Prix and gone, hey, Lando might have a chance here. Maybe we should start leaning toward him a little more. Ultimately, though, the team does need a guiding light in where they're going to be going for this season. Who are they going to back? What is their goal? Is it just the constructors? Is it both things? Or is it just the drivers? They need to know, the team, as to where they're going to develop and who to back. And when you look back at that article, there's even more to go off of. And in the grand scheme of things, the huge amount of dialogue that Stella says, one sentence is committed to backing Norris. Other than that, it's just team diplomacy and saying that the Constructors' Championship is still McLaren's first priority. And in all honesty, that's perfectly reasonable as a goal for this year, because Red Bull weren't expected to have gone astray this hard, and now resorting to mixing and matching parts to find the right combo before the supposed proper fix in time for Austin next month. Whereas McLaren have updated far less often, and therefore they have got a better car. That being said, I think the grid is starting to recognise that the buffer that Max Verstappen has established is quite a solid one. And not to mention that for a good few races, other drivers were contesting as to who was going to be the one to go after Max Verstappen and bag Grand Prix victories, most notably at the Canadian Grand Prix, when George and Lando were duking it out as to who was going to be the one to challenge Max Verstappen, who'd managed to get a little bit of a lead. They could make a decision, and that gave Max some breathing space, and that was probably one of the luckiest wins that Max had this season, and even he was aware of that. And realistically, the team title is a far more attainable goal. Even though Ferrari is starting to respond and might be a little bit of a thorn in McLaren's side, the fact is, though, is that McLaren does have the most consistent lineup on the grid, and that's down in part to the fact that Lando has gotten so many podiums, and also because Oscar has finished every single lap of every single Grand Prix and has managed to bag a good amount of points. So that's something that any team would be clamouring for. And while Stella is trying to be diplomatic about the situation, I get the impression that the other McLaren rep, Zack Brown, is far less nuanced. I get it. Zack arrived at Woking when times were tough, and he was instrumental in securing the services of Lando Norris back then for McLaren's Young Driver program. I understand that he has a close bond with Lando. He was there from the beginning, both of them. They could relate. He wants to see Lando succeed. He wants to see him thrive, be the ultimate example of the McLaren Young Driver program, which he helped establish in some shape or form with Emmanuel Pirot. It's a principle, you know? And Zack wants to see it. He's filled with pride whenever he sees Norris, whenever he talks about Lando. He thinks that he's the golden boy because he is his golden boy. He's part of his journey. That kind of praise and support is laudable, and any driver would be lucky to have a semblance of what Brown has to Norris, and I'm happy that that is actually turning into success on the track, with podiums, a couple of wins, and really starting to show the full potential of what Lando can do based on what he was able to do in his junior career. I get that, and I'm happy for them. However, this year I think it's starting to become a little bit of a sticking point, and I recall a TikTok that I saw not long after the Hungarian Grand Prix. I can't quite find it, but it is out there. After Oscar won that Grand Prix, and Zack was watching it from when he was busy with the IndyCar McLaren team, the person who made the TikTok video asked Zack whether or not he was going to get a tattoo to celebrate Oscar's victory. Zack laughed and he said no. Oscar did get a little bit of a treat when Zack came to the Belgian Grand Prix wearing a mohawk wig that was obviously orange, and that if he did get back-to-back races, I think Oscar said that he would make it more permanent, as in actually shave his head to be an orange mohawk, but ultimately that didn't happen. Oh, shame. Oscar was only 1.1 seconds away from that happening. However, I do feel like it is a little bit unfair that Zack didn't do that tradition of getting a tattoo of the Hungaroring, because, you know, he actually was witnessing a season where both of his young drivers got their first victories with McLaren. That's pretty special, you know. Almost as special as Daniel Ricciardo doing the business. Zack, they had such a good bond. It's a shame it didn't work out for them. And this feeling of mine was exacerbated somewhat on a podcast that Zack was on with NASCAR's Dale Earnhardt Jr. And he mentions the same old snippet about having two #1 drivers, but the lean seems to be more toward Lando rather than Oscar because of the history he has with the former. There's more riding on Zack. And if he can get Lando across the line in front of Max this year, then he will have achieved a huge milestone in his career as McLaren's CEO, from the back to the front. If he can get both championships, that would be even better. Now, of course, he does go on to say that Oscar Piastri is valued by the team, and of course, he's one of the two #1 drivers. And of course, McLaren wouldn't have gone to such extreme lengths with the contract recognition board if they didn't want Oscar Piastri that much. They wanted him really, really badly at a time when McLaren were really mediocre and they'd gone off the boil after a really good 2021 season and an even better 2020 season. But what really ground my gears was the fact that he said that Norris was the only one mathematically possible to go after the World Championship and that Oscar isn't. Actually, sir, I believe that all top 8 drivers currently have a mathematical chance of winning the championship currently, even after Baku. Even George Russell could storm to victory in terms of the world title. Even though it's looking very, very close, he could be dropping out very, very soon. But still, George has a chance. So anyone who's a Russell fan out there, there's still hope. And yes, Lando is the most viable candidate as of now, but that could change if Ferrari pick up the pace and Charles starts to eat into his lead, and that it's something Max counts on. His old karting rival rediscovering his mojo at Norris's expense. Further irritating Lando and McLaren fans when the team let potential wins slip through their fingers in the middle portion of the season, making both championship endeavours much easier had they actually gone with a more aggressive and bold plan, or done the obvious. And then we got to talk about Will Buxton, and no, I'm not going to be talking about his little tirade regarding McLaren and Monza, that's been done to death, and him rolling his eyes at Zack Brown saying two #1 drivers. No. There is another little soundbite which has piqued my interest, and this is something to do with what he said on a recent edition of The Race podcast. He's talking about a whisper brewing amongst the paddock and the team itself that Oscar's ceiling, according to some, is higher than Lando's, and that he might be the better candidate when it comes to long-term success with McLaren, which is something that Lando was believed to have had back when he started in 2019. The difference here, though, is that McLaren are reinventing themselves back then, and Norris is part of that rebranding exercise, which has served the team well. But right now that McLaren have gotten back on their feet and back at the front again, it's time for another rebrand. They're not the underdogs anymore, and now Piastri has come at the right time to reap most of the rewards of McLaren's building development. And Lando, he was there through thick and thin, of course, so he knows the team inside and out. But now, he's got a challenger, and that's going to be tricky unless the team actually put all of their eggs in his basket for the time being when he does have the advantage, because we do have to remember he has out-qualified Piastri for the majority of Grand Prix this year, and he has been able to accrue the most points. And I know that people are going to be talking about the Dutch Grand Prix and how he was 20, 25, 30 seconds ahead of Piastri, but that wasn't helped by the fact that Dirty Air came into the mix and George was holding up Oscar considerably. Had the shoe been on the other foot, it might have been a different story. And this potential muttering from within McLaren's own walls suggests to me that another intra-team rivalry might be on the cards soon enough. and that Andrea Stella is aware of this. He does not want that to happen at all costs. And I fear this could be a bone of contention further down the line between Zack Brown and Andrea Stella. They might eventually clash internally as to who should be the favoured driver if in 2025, right from the get-go, Max Verstappen is not the favourite when it comes to the world title, and that he's going to have to fight tooth and nail to get that 5th consecutive world championship. Every single driver in the top 3 teams, I don't really count Mercedes at the moment, maybe George at a push, they'll all be in with the chance of getting that title. And they've got to pick somebody, ultimately, after the first few races. It's going to cause some division and derision and conflict. It's bound to happen. And with Stella having had a contract extension recently to be the team principal for years to come, he is now emboldened to lead the team how he sees fit. And even though Brown is the CEO of McLaren Racing and has just as much sway seemingly, this might lead to a likening of how things went down at the team when Ayrton Senna joined them in 1988, because Senna became the disruptor after Alain Prost had established himself as the McLaren man in the 1980s, even though he did take a brief period to go and work with Renault for a couple of years. But he did come back to McLaren and he really established himself as the #1 driver. But then in comes Ayrton Senna in 1988, the new hotness, the new person of interest, and completely changes the script. He then goes on to win the world title in 1988 when McLaren had the best car ever, and then 1989 happened, and then Prost left. And whilst I reckon things won't get that bad in 2025, McLaren would be wise to tread carefully with this decision to support Lando more as of this recording. And whilst Piastri is going along with this plan for the time being, this is probably going to be yet another power play in which to ingratiate himself into the team even more. Now, I could understand if Oscar, in his youthful exuberance and him feeling like he's really coming on leaps and bounds and that the momentum is starting to come to him, that he would be aggrieved, upset, frustrated that he wasn't given a chance to go for the world title when Max is looking so vulnerable. But his youth is something to his advantage, and his improvement is coming. His ceiling, as some people are saying, the speculation, is higher than Lando, so maybe he could afford to wait that little bit longer and give Lando his chance, and if he doesn't do anything with that chance, then Oscar will come in swinging. Now, look, I want Lando to have his chance, and I believe that he can do it if he has the right support, and if he's able to speak up. If he's given the plum to go after Max and the team will back him, then he needs to also say, I need Oscar's help right now, please give it to me. He needs to speak up and not rely on the team doing it for him, because he doesn't want to be seen as the bad guy, and he wants to win fair and square. I get that, I respect that, I applaud that, but really that's not how Formula 1 works. But with Oscar being a good sport right now, I feel this could benefit him considerably in the long run. It could be a win-win-win situation. First, he has endeared himself further to the team principal in making things easier in the short term and probably earned a pat on the back from Zack. Second, he endears himself with the team at large for not having a big ego and exhibiting faith in McLaren and its employees. And when it comes to Lando winning the championship or not, for Oscar, it doesn't really matter. If Lando does his job and he wins the World Championship, then Oscar will be praised for having ultimately given his support when he is instructed to do so. I mean, I know a lot of people are a little bit aggrieved with the fact that Oscar has been actually fighting his own corner, but that's basically for the fact that, hey, I wasn't told to back off and help Lando, so I just did what I did for the team. But then there's a situation if Lando doesn't win the championship. Lando's confidence might be knocked. It might make him even more emboldened and determined. We don't know. But McLaren might have used up their IOU and goodwill with Piastri's camp, and that 2025, they might not have the team any choice but to give them equal status and see where things go for the championship next year. But again, Lando could easily pull up his socks and be fired up to do even better after missing out, and we might see him truly become Lando Prime even further. And I really hope Norris can learn from this season and use this as a catalyst to motivate himself to be even more spirited in a title hunt right from the very first race. But unfortunately, the mood over at McLaren with the management, it really doesn't fill me with confidence. It makes me feel really concerned that things are only going to get worse. And if Lando isn't able to do the deed in Baku and Oscar outqualifies him and actually then goes on to do better than him, then the script might change. We might go back to just standard papaya rules. We might go back to equal status with the team suddenly going, oh, it's not looking that likely that Lando's going to get it, so he really shouldn't impede Oscar because he might get P3 in the championship. Oh, Tuffy, oh, yeah. McLaren are trying to be diplomatic here, but sometimes diplomacy in F1 needs to be thrown out the window. Again, I really want Oscar to do well, but I also recognise that Lando has scored more and out-qualified more, so sometimes you need to bite the bullet and just go with whoever has the best chance of a championship. It's part of a team. Sure, McLaren have answered their critics by providing an answer to the cries for clarity in who's favoured, but it's a half-hearted one in my opinion, and could easily flip-flop race by race. In my mind, Piastri is in the pound seat. Right now, he's done more than enough to justify his place in Formula 1 and establish himself a fan base and a place at McLaren. He could just kick back, chill out the rest of the season, see how his teammate does against Max Verstappen, and then go from there. There is no pressure with Oscar anymore, whereas with Lando, there's even more pressure. And yes, Lando has gotten what he wanted and having the team support in some shape or form without asking for it, but he needs to make good on this, or else his teammate will not give him any quarter, as we saw in Monza. Much like how Charles Leclerc gave neither McLaren driver any quarter in Monza, when he made good on the team's indecision to take a win in Monza himself and get people talking about him again when it comes to titles. To find out why I reckon that Leclerc has started to regain his rhythm again after a really shaky middle portion of the season, go and watch this video next, and I think that it'll all be fine next year for him when Lewis Hamilton comes to call.